Baker's Railroad because it could transport wheat from Walla Walla to Wallula, where it could join up the Columbia. In fact, my father, H.B. Isaacs, was the first individual to trade with China, to sell wheat to China. And that opened up a whole market in the Northwest between Walla Walla and China. I imagine you still trade with China today. How is that relationship going? I hope well. I certainly do hope so. The very year I was born, 1866, is when my father, H.B. Isaacs, established the first water system in Walla Walla. It was primitive. It was a couple of tanks and a pump, and believe it or not, the pipes that carried water around town were poured out logs. That's right, they were wooden pipes. Much improved in 1881, when my father and my mother and my brothers established the Walla Walla Water Company. Big improvement. Mill Creek reservoirs on either side and pipes carrying the water into town. Now, of course, when you have a lot of water rights, it means you have a lot of land. And the Isaacs family had extensive land, excuse me, which meant in 1897, when the Oddfellows, the state Oddfellows, decided they wanted to build a home for widows and orphans, Walla Walla was in the running, along with Tacoma. What they did was they built a model, a giant model of the home, and they put it on a flatbed wagon, and it was pulled by 6 white horses through the streets of Seattle so everyone could see it, get a preview. Well, Walla Walla won the vote 4-1. So the house was built here, the home was built here. The Oddfellows were able to contribute $3,000, and because of his extensive land and water rights, my father promised them 6.5 acres on which to build a home, and 400 gallons of water a day. Now, who lived in the Oddfellows' home? Certainly the widows of Oddfellows, and also orphans, but there were also this group of children called half-orphans, which meant that their mothers had sadly died, and their fathers were Oddfellows, but they could have still been living. But of course, everybody knows that a man can't possibly raise children. So the children lived at the Oddfellows' home. It was a beautiful place. It had orchards and cows and chickens and gardens. A really, really lovely place. I told you that my parents were a big influence on my life. Sadly, my father died in 1900, and he died without a will. A word of advice. If you do not have a will, would you please contact an attorney and draw one up? It was very complicated, but because my mother and my brothers and the rest of my family were very, very experienced in terms of business, we were able to sort everything out. In fact, my mother established what's called the Brookside Addition, which you may have heard of. Brookside is a very small street on which our house stood, and it also had extensive development around it. Originally, though, even though it looks very elegant today, our home on Brookside is at its core just adobe bricks. But over time, it was built up and built out, and so now it really has a rather grand appearance. Perhaps you have been down Brookside. It's a very sweet little street. When my father died, 1900, life went on. We were able, as I said, to establish the Brookside Addition. And also, my mother had other projects. As I told you, she was an important influence in my life. She was devoted to women's suffrage. She was a suffragist. I would prefer that you do not refer to those women who are in favor of the right to vote as suffragettes. To me, it seems like a rather condescending term. We are all suffragists. My father was a suffragist, my brothers, men and women alike. Now, not all the women in Walla Walla were suffragists or even in favor of the right to vote, but many were. And we had very important suffragists visit this community. Abigail Scott Dunaway was very, very instrumental in getting the vote for women in Washington. But the woman that you've heard about is Susan B. Anthony. And she visited Walla Walla on more than one occasion. The first time was in 1871. Now, I was just a little girl, but I remember this very vividly. She and Abigail Scott Dunaway were coming to Walla Walla. It was not a completely carefree visit. You see, Susan B. Anthony was from Rochester, New York. And she had a dear friend there who said, Miss Anthony, when you are in Umatilla, would you please stop in and see my son? He's a bartender. And give him my love. Susan said, of course I will. She'd be glad to. And she did indeed stop in Umatilla, visited with the young man, and then made her way to Walla Walla. Well, what you need to know is that often women in the suffragist movement were also in the women's temperance movement, which means they were completely intolerant of alcohol. A rumor was spread that when Susan B. Anthony was in Umatilla visiting the young man, that she may have had a sip of wine. Well, that rumor preceded her to Walla Walla, and by the time she got here, all the church ladies in the community changed their minds and said they would not host her. Fortunately, the Isaacs family welcomed her with open arms. Suffrage has been a really significant issue in Walla Walla for a long time. And you might know that in 1877, we were given the right to vote in school board elections. That's a start. And in 1883, the territorial government gave us full voting rights in the state, which was overturned in 1887, and then reestablished, and then overturned again. Well, a group of women got together and created first we just called it the Women's Club, but it took us no time at all to realize that we really needed to concentrate on suffrage. So we changed the name to the Equal Suffrage League, and that was our goal from then on, to get the vote for women. Now, granted, I said not all women in the community were in favor, and certainly not all the men. In fact, there was a letter to the editor in the newspaper at the time by a man who said that giving the right to vote to women was worse than smallpox, chills, and fever all combined, and that if a woman gave half as much energy to her children and family as she did to getting the right to vote, we would all be better off spiritually and physically. Finally, in 1910, Washington got it right, and women were given the right to vote statewide. This was the 5th state at that time that was where women were given the right to vote, and the first in the 20th century. Now, of course, we cannot vote in federal elections. That's going to require a constitutional amendment, and here I am in 1915, and I'm sometimes not feeling terribly optimistic about that prospect. We will see what happens. I was a young woman, and you probably wondered how I occupied myself. Perhaps some embroidery, maybe crochet. No. I have always been what I think we would call a lifelong learner. I attended the Whitman Conservatory of Music, finished there, and then went to Mills College and graduated from there in California, as did my little sister, Bessie. Also, I had the opportunity to travel. So I've been to Europe more than once, and that's given me a lot of experiences on which to draw with my other activities. I know that you think that Walla Walla, and it was the case, was kind of a rough frontier town. But very early on, it also got a reputation for being a place where art and culture were emphasized and were important. As early as 1898, the Art Club was formed and is still in existence, they tell me, today. I am a painter. I know I'm an amateur, but one of my paintings did win a prize in Seattle at an exposition. And it was my oil painting called California Afternoon. And my friend Mrs. Goldreich also won a prize for her Mount Rainier. As I said, the art club is still functioning and still very, very alive today, and I'm happy to hear that. I also belong to the reading club. I was a charter member. We've had libraries come and go over time, and we've always had the challenge of having enough money to buy books for the library. And that was the goal of the reading club. We also presented papers. We had, not always serious, we had some fun too. There was that time we all dressed up in kimonos and drank tea, our Japanese tea. And then another really ingenious thing we did was we took over a whole department store. It was very generous of the owners. We did it for 3 days. I was in charge of shoes, and I think Mrs. Sharpstein was in dress goods, and then there was carpets and furniture. And a portion of those proceeds went to buy library books. We all got into kind of a friendly rivalry to see who could sell the most goods, and we raised a lot of money for the library. The very same year that the reading club was founded, I was part of the Red Cross establishment, and I was actually secretary. And then, in 1907, an incredibly important event happened, and it happened at our home on Brookside Avenue. My mother and I, and some others, established the Walla Walla Symphony. Now, I told you that I was a Conservatory of Music graduate and a musician, so of course I was a natural fit. Our goal was just to gather people together who loved music, but also to provide concerts. We got together on a regular basis. Usually we met in churches. I remember one meeting where we had 75 people, and I gave a talk on the history of opera, and we had a vocalist sing. It got very good reviews in the newspaper. But we also, as I said, provided concerts, just 2 a year, and I was in charge of programming. So I was the volunteer who planned all the music and organized all the musicians. Now, we paid a conductor, but all of our musicians were volunteers. The rest of the staff was all volunteers. I heard a wonderful story that you have a symphony still today. I'm sure that some of you here are regular attendees, and that today you actually can pay a staff to conduct it, which is wonderful. And it really does my heart good to hear that it is still functioning. We were successful with that. I have not always been successful. In 1908, I ran for the school board, and I lost. I only received 129 votes, and Fred Glasby and William Henry Kirkman received the majority of the votes, and they were voted in. But you know what was even more discouraging to me? That only 1,100 people turned out to vote. Now I know today you have a very different attitude toward voting, and you consider it to be a privilege, and I'm sure your turnout is much better. Correct? The Humane Society. I was vice president, and our very first task that we took on was to do something about rabbit drives. Have you heard of rabbit drives? I know rabbits were a problem for farmers and for gardeners. They would get into their gardens and they would eat their vegetables. Well, they organized big troops of people with guns who would go out and shoot the rabbits on a regular basis. And the sad thing about that is that often the rabbit would not be killed, would just be wounded, which means it could not move, its bones were broken, and often it just starved to death. Well, those of us in the Humane Society knew there had to be an alternative. So we had that activity banned. And people who led the rabbit drives punished. We offered a solution. We had what we call rabbit wire that could be put around your garden and protect it. Also, as the vice president, I was the person who was chosen to go and talk to schools about the humane treatment of animals, which at the time, interestingly enough, was in some cases a rather foreign idea to some people. Would it surprise you to know that I climbed Mount Rainier? I did so when I was 30 with Professor Anderson and my friend Grace Johnston. It was very, very exhilarating. I highly recommend it. The accomplishment about which I'm most proud is the establishment of the city park. I believe today we call it Pioneer Park. Can you believe it? At the turn of the century, that there were 15,000 people, and the only place where people had to gather, in green space, was the courthouse lawn. Woefully inadequate. We had the land, we had 40 acres of land ready for us, but the city council would not finance the park. So I established what was called the Women's Park Club, and you would recognize the other names on the roll: Mrs. Sharpstein, Mrs. Balmaster, Mrs. Kirkman, and we all worked together to give the city a city park. We had the land, and we had a lovely drawing by a little man named John Langdon. Now, I have heard this interesting rumor story that some people think that your park was designed by the same gentleman who did Central Park in New York. Well, that was impossible because he was dead. He died in 1903, and our park came into fruition in 1908. I think the confusion was probably because his son, John Olmsted, did indeed visit Walla Walla in 1906. Why? Well, he actually came to work with Whitman College to help them with their landscaping. And Stephen Penrose, the president, said, you know, while you are here, would you go around town with Mr. Langdon in this 1906 Oldsmobile, very fancy, and maybe give us some ideas for a park? They toured around town, and Mr. Olmsted was very kind and generous with some ideas. They showed him the land on water. He thought that looked fine. There was also land way out on 9th, and he said, you know, I think that might be a better place for your park. So that might be something you might want to consider. Well, of course, we did not do that. John Langdon is the person who designed our park. And if you hear, you know, that story about it being Frederick Law Olmsted, or even his son, John Olmsted, who designed it, please set that person straight, because it's not the case. John Langdon's design was exciting. Trees and shrubs and flowers and fountains and ponds, a zoo and a playground for children and a pavilion. He took that drawing to the city council, and they were so impressed, and they would not give us any money at all. Well, John Langdon came up with what he called the button campaign. He had buttons printed up that were exactly the same size as a silver dollar, and that's how much they cost. And on each button was a little picture of his park design. Now, he took those to merchants. They sold the buttons, but they just weren't selling fast enough. So, enter the ladies. The Women's Park Club said, we will take it on ourselves. We went from door to door. We knocked on doors and asked to see the gentleman of the house. If he came to the door and did not have a button, we sold him. If we encountered a gentleman on the street without a button, We sold him one also. We were not interested in excuses such as, oh, it's at home on the bureau. If he does not wear a button, he bought a button. Still, we needed more money. So we started organizing card parties to which we would charge admission. We had numerous entertainments, some professional, some amateur, musical, dancing. Also, I remember the time that Madame Lamar did her physical culture demonstration. A lot of them were at Keeler Grand Theater. They were really very, very important. Some people call them kermisses, which is a Dutch word for entertainment. We finally raised enough money to landscape our park. We went to the city council, we presented them with our accomplishments, and they reluctantly said, all right, we will pay for the irrigation. So the park came into being. In 1908, I think this was probably the proudest day of my life. We opened the park. Now I know this is 1909 because the pavilion and the playground, a lot of other features did not come into being until 1909. But it was a thrilling moment for me. In fact, such a lovely memory that today, when I was visiting, I revisited the park. I have my hat. And I have my picture taken again. This time in color at the park, of which I am so very, very proud. I challenged you at the beginning of my talk as to whether or not you think this single woman, the one without the husband and the children and marriage, has indeed led a full, a productive, and an important life and given a lot to her community. What do you think? I was no longer with us in 1940.
I think.
And I'm not a big golfer, so no, I did not have anything to do with golf.
How you doing?
Hi there. So we're doing medicine of the expedition here. I was just about cruise inside to visit with the folks, but we'll visit with you folks.
Sounds good.
What I have here is all the medicine that was purchased for the expedition, that was collected along the way, herbal medicine, and everything is real except the opium and the laudanum, and there's about 60 meds here.
Wow.
And the instruments are almost all real, Revolutionary War to Civil War era. And I can tell you anything you could possibly ask about medicine of the era because I am the expert authority.
Nice. Mind if I get your picture?
Sure.
Thank you.
No, I don't mind. But
So what was chocolate used for?
well, chocolate, as you can ask any kid, makes you feel better. Of course, moms say, well, it makes them a little hyper. Chocolate contains quite a number of medically active medicines, including a little caffeine, which keeps them active, theobromine, which makes you feel better. It gives you a sense of well-being. But it's also a carminative, and a carminative is something that settles your stomach. So on the way back from the expedition, they were pretty much out of medicine, and as they get close to St. Louis, they meet a trader coming upstream with a bunch of men and whiskey and food and stuff, and Clark was feeling a little bit under the weather, had stomach upset, and York, his slave, got some chocolate from the expedition, gave it to him, probably in an unsweetened drink. and so we have evidence of chocolate. They didn't carry chocolate, but they received it from an expedition coming upstream, all of whom thought they had long been killed. When they went by, on their way back, they thought they had all disappeared, been wiped out. They had no idea that they survived. And so they were real happy and said, well, we thought you were dead. Here, have some whiskey, have some corn. They were out of corn, and
They were out about everything
they
by
were out
then.
about everything, right?
So that's why it helps with my migraines.
They
Yeah.
were out of about everything except gunpowder and lead. They had enough to do the expedition all over again. And when you go over there and look at their lead canisters and hear that story, why they actually had that left over, and but almost everything else, they're down to leathers like this.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Very
I can
cool.
talk for 5 hours, so I'll let you ask the questions. That way I can answer whatever you might have. This is one of 26 medical tests I've produced, and it's the one that's easiest for me to carry around. I'm going to start to go around by.
Some beautiful antiques.
Yeah, most of these, like there are some blacksmiths forged dental tools. This is a classic, what they call a tooth key. You put it over the back molar, and then you do a quick snap, and that molar comes out sideways, breaks the roots off and the jawbone and maybe the side of the jawbone. Then you dig out the leftovers with this. Now this is Civil War or later, but this is Rev War era. This is 200 years old at least.
Wow.
This is Civil War here. Normally, teeth ended up coming out and abscessed.
Mm-hmm.
When you get an abscessed tooth like I had in Tibet, in the high plateau of Tibet, I wish I'd have had this tool in Asia, and some pretty wild backcountry stories and terrorist country. And
With the military, or?
I was, I was in the military in 61 to 64, but that was before Vietnam, so I just played with bombs and explosives. But when I got to teach,
That's good. That's how life is, isn't it? You choose it when you wake up in the morning. That'd be fun. You know what?
Yeah.
We go around that way, or?
Because with the way it's positioned, this finger is right at the very. Thank you very much for the information. We're going to keep wandering. Yeah, please do that. Have you guys seen that? We're heading over that direction now. Right, and then there's the guy with uniforms and clothing, and then there's the guy that's about making salt down there at the end down there. Okay, perfect. All right.
Thank you.
Yep, you betcha.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good.
Good, good. Glad to hear that. Where are you folks from?
Here from Walla Walla.
Walla Walla? You sure it's not some place far away, like College Place or something? Like
Yeah, that place too.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, actually, we're in the county, so we're in neither one.
Well, okay. All right. You live out in the woods. All right. Yeah, a bunch of mountain men or whatever, huh? Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I have a friend who lives up north of here a little ways in Dixie.
Yeah.
And, because that's not very far. And I know people that live in Prescott and Waitsburg and Dayton. And I live in the Tri-Cities, so,
Oh,
yeah. So I come this way. So how are you folks? You're doing all right then?
Yeah.
Rapid rate. Kind of little heats up.
It's in the shade, beating the heat.
yeah.
The interesting stuff.
Yeah, always, yeah. Yeah, he kind of gives you the internals, what these blocks look like on the inside, how they're made and everything, and this is kind of the exterior version. This is what they look like in usable form. They're all flintlocks. which means that the pistols and the rifles, regardless, they may look different, but they all function exactly the same. Variations on the theme. And so it doesn't matter if it's a pistol or a rifle, they're going to load and they're going to be primed and fired the same way. And very little variation in that, except for maybe the military weapon, they might use paper cartridges.
Preloaded.
To get your powder and your ball together, that's going to be one less step than if you have separate powder and separate ball. And that was the whole point. In firearms development has been about one simple question: how fast can we get a second shot?
Yeah.
You know, these are like one shot reload, to now 600 rounds a minute, and you only hear every third round.
Yeah.
You know, and so in the case in 220 years ago, when you didn't have the mechanical ability to increase your rate of fire, you had to do it other ways. So that's where the invention of pre-made cartridges and drill them in, and how to load and fire, like muscle memory. Without thinking, cutting tools, and flint was for your projectile tips.
You can like, I gotta get where's the shower? Well,
This is the very first replica of the very first gun ever commissioned by the U.S. government. It's called the 1795 Springfield musket. Okay? It's a carbon copy of the French Charleville musket that we used during the American Revolution, except the French were smaller people, and so the length from here to the trigger to the butt plate was about an inch and a quarter shorter. That was the only complaint our soldiers had with it. So when they designed it, they just copied the French style, but they added an inch and a quarter to the butt plate for the larger Americans. If you were to shoot a gun, one of these muzzleloaders, that's an inch and a half, either too short for you or an inch and a half too long, it would be very uncomfortable to shoot.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And usually your length of pull is your length from this joint of your finger to the inside of your elbow.
Oh.
That's your length of pull.
this is just
I'm 13 5/8 is perfect for me. But anyway, to load this thing, it weighs 10.5 pounds empty. It shoots a ball this size, 435 grain ball, traveling about 12 to 1,500 feet per second. Now it's soft lead, so whatever it hits, even tissue, it starts to mash out. The hole going in might be this big, but the hole going out, and it will go out, will be something like that. You would lose, it hit you right here, you would lose your arm.
Yeah.
You'd lose you damage your shoulder. You may survive, you may not. Now, the British, Americans, French, 4 times a minute. Now, how are you going to do that? You got a cartridge box. It's a black cartridge box. Inside is a wooden insert that's got a bunch of holes drilled in it, anywhere from 15 to about 22 holes that will hold these pre-made charges. And you just pull one out, and there's 9 different commands for getting your gun from empty to firing. And so they go through them. First step would be to pull it out of the cartridge, pull this back to half, your hammer back to half cock, tear this off, fill this with powder, put the frizzen down. Now you pour the rest of the powder down the barrel, push the paper and the ball down the barrel, thumb start it down the barrel, pull your ramrod, push the ball and powder and paper down on the powder, compress the powder. Now it's an explosive. Before that, it's not. I could dump a pound of powder on the ground, hit it with a match, it'd go whoosh, a lot of smoke, maybe a little bit of flash, but no bang.
Yeah.
Take a portion of it, put it down the barrel, compress it behind the ball. It's going to be, and now it's an explosive. Okay, so you turn the ramrod.
On how fast and rapid that the trade routes among the Indian nations were.
Bring the weapon up,
Is that when they got to the Great
second
Falls
position, and then
Montana,
see this
they were foraging around because
little
they
hole in the barrel right there?
water with the boat.
Okay, what's going to happen is, if this was loaded,
Ready to go on
this hammer's going to come forward, it's going to hit this frizzen face, and as the hammer's pushing the frizzen open, it's going to scrape, the flint's going to scrape down the edge here, and dump sparks into the pan.
So, today, I mean, it was
Ignite
just like
that
a
powder. It's going to
trade-off.
flash.
So
It won't
thought
go
that
bang,
inside had something
and that
to do
flash is
with
going to jump through the barrel.
So
The hole in the barrel
things travel very
gun's going to
fast
go off.
amongst the Indians.
Okay, now it takes a long time to
while they were
explain
there
it,
at the
but it
Great
happens
Falls,
like that.
but you could
Less
tell
than a
back
third
with
of a
the air
second,
rifle,
if everything's working right.
that broke.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and watch right here,
Mainspring,
and watch for the
the air
sparks.
rifle broke.
On three. 1, 2, 3.
Nice.
Yeah, only takes one spark to ignite that powder. So if you got 3 or 4 sparks, you got plenty of spark there to do that. So that's what they would load in the beginning. The expedition had these with the cartridge boxes, but over time these would get used up. They'd get wet. When they get wet, they're done.
Yeah.
You tear it apart. You save the lead. The powder's wet and mucky. It's going to turn to a wet, mucky paste, and so you're done. From that point on, they used loose powder in powder horns, and they had shot pouches where they kept their ball and cleaning patches and everything to keep their guns operating. The shooting pouch is not a catch-all. It's just to maintain and shoot that gun. Nothing else goes in there. Now that might include patches, or grease patches, dry patches for cleaning. The round ball might include a collapsible ladle. Put that in there. Might include the mold for your whatever caliber you've got. If you had a long rifle built in the old days, the gun maker would make your rifle. He'd slug the barrel to make sure you got the right diameter, and then he'd make your mold. He might even sight your gun in for you. Yeah, full meal deal. Yeah.
That's cool.
And so, but then as time wore on, they would have to use the loose powder, what they call loose powder and loose ball, instead of the pre-made charges. So what do you do with all this powder that you've got to carry with you? Okay, powder bag.
Carried all the way across around the Great Falls.
Interesting proposition.
No, they cashed it up. But this is now they're going to have to deal with horseback. They're not going to be taking manbull and seals and horseback. That's a lot of ways. They cashed it up. Now, what do I mean by cashing up? Is that it's a practice that even the American fur traders use. But they basically dug in a cave, a little bit down on the earth, build the bottom of it with a little bit of a platform so you can keep any moisture off your merchandise.
Should we go check out the rest of it?
Cover it up. Put some kind of markers around it so that way you would recognize it.
And I didn't know because I know you're looking for hides. And let's give them.
The little flower.
Now, the Jefferson and Lewis families were well acquainted. They were essentially neighbors around Charlottesville, Virginia, Albemarle County. Okay. So he knew Lewis's father very well. He knew about Lewis from when he was a boy. When he sent his message to Congress asking for money for the expedition, $3,500 ended up happening for him. He wrote a letter to Congress. You're trying to live your life without him.
Oh, and next month, on the weekend after Labor Day, we will be in Seaside, Oregon, and we will be making salt. If they don't give us a fire ban like they never do now. But we will be making salt. And this is salt from that we have made in the past. You want a sample? Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, just
How did you make the salt?
exactly the way they did. Boil it out of
A lot of water.
That's
Well,
really
like what?
salty.
what?
Salty.
Yeah,
Salt.
it's pretty pure.
It's very pure. Wow.
In fact, there's a company that just a little ways down from Seaside does what we do, only they do it, of course, on a big industrial. They have a,
Right.
you know, they have a line going, you know, tube going way out into the ocean, and pulling seawater in from there, and then bringing it in, and it's an industrialized version of what we do. We do it the old-fashioned way with through all labor and boiling, but they do that in vast, you know, stills and so forth. But it's exactly the same process. You just boil seawater until all the water's gone and what's left is salt.
And it takes how long?
Let's see, depending on the size, it would take about, this is our smallest one here, it would take, if it was full to the brim, it would take about 2 hours for it to boil down to this little slurry, which is on the bottom. And then you would scoop it out, and then you put it on the board. And you kind of separate it out like that, so that it helps it dry, evaporate all the water out of it, and then put it into a cloth bag and squeeze all the water out of it. And then what's left over, you put it in the cask. You could never get it completely dry, and not in an Oregon winter, you know, in January and February. But leaving it a little wet was good.
Here you go.
Sure.
It wouldn't dry out. Dry it.
What kind of tree is that? I don't know if I want to touch it. I don't know. I've never seen one before. It's like little octopuses hanging from it.
These buildings don't change.
This thing's amazing, isn't it?
Hello there. Nice of you to visit me. My name is George Van Bachman from Walla Walla County. I am one of the first convicts put in this territorial prison in 1887. I'm here for 6 years and 3 months for horse stealing. I want you to know I didn't do it. You see, this guy loaned me his horse. I didn't steal it. This is a terrible place to live. You see that bucket over there in the corner? Well, that's my toilet. They let me dump it out once a day, but that does not help the smell in here. Being locked up in this little space with nothing to do makes you crazy. The food is terrible, and people you meet in here are not very nice. Say, you happen to have a piece of candy? I haven't had any candy for a year. There is one good thing here. The warden allows someone to bring you a cake on your birthday. Mine is next week. So would you bake one and bring it to me? Would you mind putting a file in the cake? That would help with my future plans.
Just a birthday cake.
Yeah.
design.
Look at this cap in there, you see that?
What?
A cap, wiener, the wiener cap and the cow. Look at it. Ow, long run. They put that on the
Oh yeah, it is.
That would just separate them.
And they got some new signs up too.
Camper.
It's a sheep.
Sheep shirt.
It's a sheep wagon.
Sea cleaner.
That's terrible.
Huh.